30 million people heard Victor Kazan say he would break Bruce Lee in half. He said it the way a man says something he considers a simple statement of physical fact. Not cruel, not performed, just the calm, almost generous certainty of someone who has spent his entire adult life being correct about exactly this kind of question. He said it on live television, in front of a studio audience that laughed before he had even finished the sentence, because the image itself was funny to them. A man who weighed nearly 300 pounds talking about a man who weighed less than half that. Bruce Lee said 3 words back, and in the time it took 30 million people to process what those 3 words actually meant, the studio that had been laughing a moment earlier went completely, uniformly silent. This is the story of the night a world wrestling champion made a casual threat on national television, and the 3 words that ended the conversation before it had properly begun. The program was called Sports Spotlight, and in the autumn of 1972, it occupied one of the more reliable hours in American sports broadcasting. A Thursday evening interview format that paired athletes from different disciplines and let the conversation find its own shape under the guidance of a veteran host named Walter Pierce, who had built a 20-year career on knowing exactly when to let a moment breathe and exactly when to step in and redirect it. Victor Kazan was the reigning World Wrestling Federation heavyweight champion, a title he had held for 2 years through a combination of genuine technical skill and a physical presence that made most of his opponent's resistance feel, by the second round, like a formality. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. He weighed 294 pounds. He had a reputation, even among people who didn't follow wrestling closely, as a fundamentally decent and likable man, generous with fans, patient with reporters, not the kind of performer who needed to manufacture villainy to draw a crowd. People who worked with him consistently described him as someone whose confidence came from a genuinely settled place rather than insecurity, which made what happened that evening more complicated than a simple story about arrogance. Bruce Lee had been invited onto the program to discuss the upcoming release of his next film, and the producers, sensing an opportunity in the visual and conceptual contrast between their 2 guests, had scheduled him for the same segment as Kazan. The first portion of the interview unfolded the way these things usually unfolded. Pleasant, structured, each man given room to discuss his own work without much direct interaction between them. Kazan talked about an upcoming title defense. Bruce Lee talked about the physical philosophy behind the choreography in his films, language that Walter Pierce found visibly interesting and occasionally had to ask him to clarify for a general audience.
Then Walter Pierce opened the floor to audience questions, which was a regular feature of the program and usually produced nothing more dramatic than requests for training advice or questions about upcoming opponents. The 4th question came from a college-aged man in the 2nd row who, when handed the microphone, asked, with the slightly nervous energy of someone who has been waiting through 3 other questions to ask the one he actually came with, what would happen if the 2 men on stage ever had to face each other directly. The studio responded with an immediate ripple of amused anticipation. It was, by the standards of the program, an unusually direct question, and everyone in the room understood immediately that it was the kind of question built for exactly this kind of contrast. Walter Pierce, 20 years of instinct kicking in immediately, turned first to Kazan, sensing correctly that the bigger reaction would come from him. Kazan smiled. It was a warm smile, not a mean one. The smile of a large, comfortable man being asked a question he found genuinely amusing, rather than threatening in any sense. He picked up the handheld microphone from the table between them. He said, "Him? I'd break him in half." He said it with a small laugh built into the delivery, the kind of laugh that signaled he intended the comment affectionately rather than as an insult, the good-natured condescension of someone who simply could not take the premise of the question seriously given the math involved, 294 pounds against 135. To Victor Kazan in the autumn of 1972, this was not a controversial assessment. It was arithmetic. The studio laughed, not at Bruce Lee exactly, but at the bluntness of the math being stated out loud, the specific comedy of an enormous man saying something obviously comfortably true about a much smaller one. Walter Pierce, smiling along with the room, turned the microphone toward Bruce Lee with the easy expectation of a gracious, self-deprecating response, the kind of moment that made for good television precisely because everyone already knew roughly how it would go. Bruce Lee was smiling too. He had been smiling, in fact, through Kazan's entire answer, in a way that several people watching the broadcast later described as different in quality from an embarrassed or polite smile, though it took the next 30 seconds for anyone to understand exactly what that difference meant. He looked at Kazan. He said 3 words. He said, "You could try."
The studio laughter, which had been rolling steadily through the room since Kazan's comment, stopped within the space of a single breath. It wasn't the words themselves that did it. Taken alone, on paper, "you could try" reads as almost nothing. 3 syllables of mild defiance that wouldn't register as remarkable in most conversations. What stopped the room was the way Bruce Lee said them. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness, no competitive edge of the kind that usually accompanies a challenge. He said it with the exact same calm, settled, almost courteous tone he had used throughout the entire interview, as if he were simply confirming a fact that Kazan had gotten slightly wrong, the way you might gently correct someone's math without making it personal. It was the tone more than the content that made 30 million people stop laughing at once. Walter Pierce, who had hosted this program for over 2 decades and had absorbed through pure repetition an instinct for when a moment had shifted into something the format hadn't planned for, sat very still with the microphone hovering between his 2 guests. Kazan's smile faded, not into anger, but into something more complicated. He looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment, the easy condescension of 30 seconds earlier visibly recalibrating into something closer to genuine reassessment. He was a professional. He had spent 15 years reading opponents in a ring, developing the specific instinct that separates fighters who survive long careers from those who don't, the ability to distinguish bravado from conviction, performance from fact. What he was looking at, he said later in an interview given years afterward, did not read as bravado. He asked, with noticeably less certainty than he'd carried 30 seconds earlier, "You serious?" Bruce Lee's expression didn't change. He said, "Completely." The studio audience, which had gone from laughter to silence to something that now resembled genuine tension, watched Walter Pierce visibly weigh whether to diffuse the moment or let it continue. 20 years of broadcast instinct told him, correctly, that interrupting now would be a mistake the audience would never forgive him for. He asked carefully whether either man wanted to actually demonstrate anything, phrasing it as an invitation rather than a provocation, giving both men an exit if they wanted one. Kazan looked at Bruce Lee for a moment, then he stood up from his chair. He was a large man, and standing emphasized the scale of him in a way that sitting across an interview table had partially obscured. 6 feet 6 inches of genuinely formidable, professionally conditioned mass, moving with the easy, settled confidence of someone who had never once in 15 years of professional competition needed to doubt what his own size meant in a physical confrontation. Bruce Lee stood as well, and the contrast, fully visible now to 30 million households, was the kind of contrast that didn't require commentary to register. He looked, standing next to Kazan, like a different category of physical being entirely. Not weaker exactly, but simply scaled to an entirely different measurement. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a fight. There was no ring, no rules established beyond an unspoken mutual understanding that this would be a demonstration rather than a real confrontation, conducted in front of cameras in a television studio that had not been designed for anything physical beyond two people shaking hands.
Kazan reached for him first, a controlled, professional grab aimed at the shoulder, the opening move of a wrestler who has built an entire 15-year career around the assumption that if his hands make contact, the contest is functionally decided. His hands closed on air. Bruce Lee had moved, not far, not dramatically, simply the minimum required to no longer be in the specific 6 inches of space that Kazan's enormous hands had committed to occupying. Kazan, carried forward by momentum that had nowhere productive left to go, had to take an extra step to recover his stance, an adjustment that a man his size rarely needed to make and that visibly registered on his face as something close to surprise. He tried again, faster, adjusting his angle. The result was identical. His hands found nothing. Bruce Lee was simply elsewhere by the smallest possible margin every single time. By the third attempt, the studio was utterly silent, 30 million households watching a sequence that none of the production's normal trajectory had anticipated. A heavyweight wrestling champion failing, repeatedly and visibly, to do the one thing his entire 15-year career had told him he could always, eventually do. On the fourth attempt, Kazan committed fully, a genuine full-effort lunge that abandoned the careful, controlled approach of the first 3 and replaced it with the simple, overwhelming physical commitment that had ended most of his professional matches. It was the kind of effort that, against any conventional opponent, would have ended the exchange immediately. Bruce Lee stepped to the side, and as Kazan's own momentum carried him forward past where his target had briefly stood, placed one open palm against the larger man's extended forearm, barely contact at all, a redirection rather than a strike, and Kazan's own overcommitted weight did everything else. He stumbled 2 full steps, caught himself against the edge of the interview table, and stood there for a moment, breathing harder than a missed grab should have made a man of his conditioning breathe. The silence that followed was, according to people present in that studio, unlike anything the broadcast had produced before or would produce again in the years the program continued to air. Kazan straightened up. He looked at Bruce Lee. And then, in a moment that several crew members present that night described years later as the genuinely admirable part of the entire story, he laughed. Not the easy laugh from the start of the segment, a different laugh entirely, the laugh of a man encountering something that had just rewritten an assumption he'd carried, without examination, for his entire professional life. He extended his hand. Bruce Lee took it. Kazan said loud enough for the studio microphones to catch clearly, "I owe you an apology." Bruce Lee shook his head slightly. He said there was nothing to apologize for, that Kazan's assessment had been reasonable given the information available to him, and that the only thing that had changed was the information itself. Walter Pierce, watching the exchange with the specific relief of a host who understands he has just witnessed something he will be talking about for the rest of his career, asked Kazan on air what he had just learned. Kazan thought about it for a moment. He said that he had spent 15 years assuming that size determined outcomes because in 15 years, against every opponent he had faced, it always had. He said he had just learned in front of 30 million people that the assumption had simply never been tested against the right kind of opponent before, and that the math he had been so confident about minutes earlier had never actually been the right math to begin with. The segment, originally scheduled for 8 minutes, ran for 23 minutes. Walter Pierce later called it the single most discussed moment in his program's broadcast history, generating more viewer mail in the following 2 weeks than any other segment the show had aired in its first decade on air. Kazan and Bruce Lee corresponded occasionally in the months that followed.
Kazan, in an interview given many years later, said that the 8 seconds in that studio had taught him more about the actual nature of physical capability than 15 years of professional competition had managed to teach him. Not because he had been defeated in any formal sense, but because he had been shown, cleanly and without malice, that the entire framework he'd used to predict outcomes his whole career had a blind spot he'd never once been forced to examine. He said he never again assumed, walking into a room, that he already knew how a physical confrontation would go before it started. Bruce Lee never discussed the segment publicly in detail afterward. People close to him said this was entirely typical. He had no interest in the symbolic victory, no need to revisit a moment that had already, completely and without ambiguity, said everything that needed saying. The 3 words themselves, "You could try," became in the years that followed one of the most quoted phrases associated with him, repeated by people who had never seen the original broadcast and didn't know the specific context that gave them their weight. But the people who were in that studio, who had watched 30 million households go from laughter to total silence in the space of 3 syllables, understood something that quote alone could never fully carry. It wasn't the words that had silenced the room. It was the complete, unshakable calm underneath them, the quiet certainty of a man who never needed to raise his voice to tell you exactly where the truth actually stood. If this story reminded you that real confidence never needs volume to be heard, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend. Because Bruce Lee never argued with anyone who underestimated him. He simply let them find out, quietly, exactly how wrong they were.